Well, hi Nalise, thanks so much for joining us again. We've got a few questions to run through today, and the subject of today's discussion is the environmental toll of PPE, with a particular examination of the emissions that are produced throughout the product life cycle. So, without further ado, my first question is that sustainability plays an increasingly important role in the workplace, and for many industries, it's essential. So, first of all, I'd like to ask whether there is even such a thing as a sustainable or reduced impact PPE solution.
Yeah, good first question. And I'm glad you're asking me now because I think if you asked me a few years ago, I'd be less sure about my answer. But now I would say absolutely. Sustainable PPE solutions, they're increasingly becoming available at sort of corporate level, but even available for quite small businesses. And more industries now I've seen are focused on reducing their environmental impact because all of us know every business, regardless of its activities, has an environmental footprint. So we're all looking for different ways to lower that. And when we talk about sustainable PPE, what are we really talking about? Well, we're talking about the equipment that is being designed, thinking specifically about the environmental impact that it's going to have and throughout its life cycle. So not just at the end when we're disposing of the product, but all the way from the start when we're actually sourcing some of those renewable materials and raw materials. And I think from what I've seen, especially working sort of in-house in construction, but also working with other companies that are looking to reduce their impact, and what they're starting to use are things like gloves that have been made from biodegradable materials. So this could be something like natural rubber, as an example. I've also seen safety vests that have been made from recycled polyester and some quite nice designs. And actually, what I've seen, especially since COVID, is face masks that were made from organic cotton. So yeah, of course, PPE is there to provide protection for people, but it can at the same time also minimize waste, and also think about the types of resources that are being consumed and being very mindful of that. So yeah, I think we've come a long way since the last couple of years.
Now, so that's, there's an ideal there, but not every industry can use those more sustainable materials. They
Mm.
can often cause higher emissions in the manufacturing process when it comes to PPE. So it's not
Yeah.
always a simple fix. But what are some of the key criteria a customer could look for to identify the most sustainable PP option for them?
Good question. And it's practical, so it's a good question to ask. So I think first and foremost, what is obviously the easiest is to look directly at the materials themselves. So you can ask some really easy questions, either to the supplier or you can do the research yourself. So look at the materials and see whether they are recycled. That's the easiest one. If they're not recycled, then see whether they are biodegradable. And if they're not biodegradable or recycled, you can still see whether they've been responsibly sourced. So where have they been sourced? What has the process been to source those materials? And something that I think a lot of companies can use sort of as that gold stamp is look for certifications. So a common one being ISO 14001. I think most businesses would have heard of this. And this is a really good indicator of best practice environmental standards. So, of course, it is important to look at the manufacturing process too. It's not just about the raw materials themselves. So you do need to think about whether the company that is manufacturing the specific PPE is, running on renewable energy, for example. So where are their operations? How are they sourcing that energy? Are they thinking about or actually reducing their water consumption? And as you said earlier, what are they doing about their emissions? Are they planning on cutting them down, or are they already taking steps to cut them down? And the last thing I'd say is what you alluded to earlier as well, which is about, safety is important, but product durability is also important. So if you had a long-lasting, let's say, helmet, for example, then you don't need to replace it as often. Same for, let's say, long-lasting boots or gloves, you don't need to replace them as often. So it definitely means that they're going to be around for longer, and there's going to be less need for replacement. I think another thing that's important to consider is the other obvious one. One being, is it recycled to start with or made from recycled materials? But then also, what does the end of life look like? So when you're finished with that PPE, what's going to happen to it? Is it something that it can be recycled as a product? Is it something where the supplier is offering a take-back scheme, which is what I saw a lot on reusable booties or potential other gloves? And all of this also then makes it easier for you as a company to dispose of your PPE responsibly because you're not trying to have to find how to dispose of it. If your supplier is already making it very easy through a take-back scheme, it's one less thing to have to think about.
I think you've touched on that on my next question, really, but it's about the manufacturing process and how are PPE products manufactured typically, and how can we think of this in terms of the full product life cycle?
Yeah, such a good question. And I think this is something that people don't often ask themselves. For example, when we buy shoes or bags or other apparel, we don't necessarily think about how they're being made. But PPE is an interesting one. So most PPE that I think we've all seen is typically made from a synthetic material. So it's typically made from plastics. So we know that obviously comes from fossil fuels. Other times we can see them being made from natural materials. Most commonly, these would be things like rubber boots, or cotton. And as you mentioned, when we're thinking about the whole product life cycle, this production process, whether it's boots or helmets or gloves, it can be really resource intensive because it often is using a lot of water, a lot of energy, and a lot of chemicals too. So yeah, it is important to think about each of those stages, like we were talking about earlier, from the point of actually extracting the raw material to the point of manufacturing, and then of course also transporting it to where it needs to go, and then disposal. So there's a lot of different steps, and each kind of step along the way is carrying its own set of impacts that we need to think about. But what I would say is that if you can think about the whole product life cycle, it will help you to make a better choice. And if you can find more information about the manufacturing process or even the life cycle, it'll help you to understand where some of the most carbon intensive activities are. So a good example, I always like to think about COVID because it's a time when a lot of us were thinking about PPE or using PPE. You might have thought, okay, instead of using a disposable mask, maybe I'll use a traditional, one of those face shields that everyone had. But if you don't look at the full life cycle of the product, you might actually be making a worse off choice environmentally because potentially that face shield isn't being used as many times as it would need to be used for it to be a more environmentally friendly option. So yeah, you really have to look at not only the raw materials, but also the whole manufacturing and disposal process as well.
How can organizations go about making those more responsible PPE choices? I think you've covered some of the points, but just a general guide to people would be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, the way that I've seen it work most effectively is if from the start they are embedding sustainability into their procurement policies. So within your organization, if you truly want to make, let's say, more responsible choices when it comes to PPE or even to other areas, then it is really about setting that intention from the start, making sure that there is a goal around it, making sure that there's clear actions and that there is a target. It could be a qualitative target, it doesn't have to be a quantitative target, but once you have that sort of framework in place, it means that you're in a much better position to actually start working with suppliers and working within the value chain with organizations that have very strong environmental credentials, because you would have established that that's something that you need as a business to make a responsible choice. You'd also then know, for example, that when you work with different suppliers, that you need to make sure that they're using sustainable materials. You might want to make sure that they are disclosing the whole life cycle of the product so that you have a better understanding of, what emissions have been created in the development of the product, but also for the end of life, is there any positive impacts? For example, do they have a recycling program to make sure that whatever equipment that you're buying from them isn't then going to end up in landfill. And I think something else that's really important, and it's not to be understated, is training. Because you can have the most amazing sustainable PPE, but if people don't understand how to use it properly, don't understand how to take care of it, don't understand that it actually, in many cases, can be reused, then of course you're not going to actually extend the life of some of these products. So it is important to make sure people understand what it is that you're introducing, how it works, and why it is a responsible choice so that they can be more responsible in the way that they use the PPE as well.
Returning back quickly to the manufacturing process, how can the impact of PPE be reduced specifically during that process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's very similar to most manufacturing processes. It's really, I think, looking at things like the energy sources. So, are they renewable, for example? What sort of backup power solutions do you have? Do you have any on-site renewables, or is it all coming from the grid? What's the reliance there? Think also looking at things like water use and energy use in terms of efficiency. So how is a company or how are companies optimizing their production processes so that they can use less water and of course less energy as well. And then back on chemicals, I think there's a huge reliance on very harmful chemicals, and we don't always think about what that does to the environment, but also to us in terms of human health. So it is really important to think about chemicals, which are a huge source of emissions, and seeing how you can design out those chemicals or at least lower the amount that are being used. So what I've seen is a lot of these manufacturers kind of at the forefront of sustainability. What they're already doing is they're shifting to solar powered facilities. They're looking at things like closed loop water systems, where the water that is being produced or that is used during the recycling or manufacturing process is then recycled back to be used again. So it really is a truly sustainable way of looking at production as instead of looking at things in isolation. And yeah, finally, I think when we look at the manufacturing process, trying to understand whether the manufacturing is being done in a way that extends the life cycle of that product. So, for example, are they designing the PPE for durability in the first place? And therefore, when they're manufacturing, are they thinking about the stitching process? Are they thinking about the way that the product is being put together to make sure that it can either be replaced in parts or, for example, from the get-go, they're manufacturing it in a way which should extend its life cycle generally as it's being used more and more.
Moving away from the specific of the manufacturing process, obviously there's implications elsewhere. So where else in that product life cycle can impact be reduced or recycled materials increased?
Yeah, really good point. I think, again, one that people often forget about is the transportation element. It's the same with sort of any product. So if you can look at a logistics sort of program and look at your logistics supplier, and you can start to understand how they could optimize either their routes or the vehicles that they're using or the way that they're doing their deliveries. That might be things like switching to an electric delivery vehicle, or it might be consolidating shipments so there's fewer journeys that are happening. Those are all things that I think that can be done relatively easily. Of course, it is reliant on the supply and reliant on the value chain cooperating, but those are things that can definitely have a significant impact because, again, transportation is very emission intensive. Again, on the life cycle, we're talking about taking care of PPE. It is really important that not only those who are wearing the PPE, but also those that are in charge of making sure that the PPE is safe and maintained, understands how to maintain that PPE. For example, the employee might be wearing the PPE, but then I've often seen other staff, whether it be cleaning staff or welfare staff, not understanding or not being aware of the fact that it's reusable or there's a specific way of maintaining it. And then because that training has been extended to that person, the life cycle of that PPE is shortened quite a lot. So it's really important to make sure everyone understands how to maintain it. And I do think looking for suppliers that offer recycling programs is really important because at the end of the day, the last thing we want is to have all this wonderful PPE created and it's going to end up in landfill because that is very emission intensive. So if you can from the beginning identify whether there's a recycling program either directly with the supplier or through a different supplier, then that would be great. I think another thing is using PPE that's made from recycled materials so that if you can't do it at the end, you can kind of look at it from the beginning of its journey. And yeah, this obviously is going to enable a circular economy to be established. And I think once customers see that, they often see a lot of financial savings. They see a lot of savings, even in productivity, because employees aren't having to take things off and put things back on if it can be reused, for example, or throw things away. So, and there can actually be some pretty significant financial savings as well.
And just picking up on something you mentioned there, landfill.
Yeah.
We often hear businesses talking about the adoption of zero waste to landfill as a strategy. In your experience, is that proving to be a differentiator, a competitive advantage? Is it something that businesses' customers are necessarily looking out for?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Again, I think if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, my response might have been different, but I have definitely seen in the last few years how different companies that are adopting some of these policies, whether it be zero waste to landfill or net zero carbon, these definitely have a significant competitive advantage. And why is that? I think it's because a lot of these companies in the past, they would have put it out there as something that they're doing, because they care about the planet or it's important to the business. But now, because of different regulations that are coming in, because of all the savings that companies need to make, I actually think that they're doing it more driven from a financial perspective as opposed from what could have been seen as a greenwashing perspective in the past. So yeah, I think a lot of companies are doing it because they see that they can comply and reduce risk of fines. They see financial savings, operational savings, and they're seeing improved brand reputation. Especially if their clients or their customers are looking out for that, that's something that then drives them to want to do it more. And yeah, I have really seen a lot of customers also seeking out suppliers who specifically have zero waste to landfill policies because they have their own internal targets. And that means that within their value chain, they need to identify suppliers and other sort of organizations that have similar commitments, that they're all working towards the same goal. And I did see this when working in construction. So we had our own targets on site. And we were actually looking for PPE suppliers that offered take-back programs because it helped us to meet our own sustainability targets by reducing waste. So yeah, definitely, I think more and more there is definitely a competitive advantage.
I suppose one of the reservations people may have when thinking about the adoption of sustainable PPE is performance and quality, and the need maybe for a compromise. But how does more sustainable PPE options, how do they typically perform when it comes to safety? And do we ever lose anything in terms of their quality or their performance?
Yeah, a really good question. I was definitely met with this a lot when I worked on site because it's a fair question to ask, and I completely understand. And I had to do a lot of research, and I met with a lot of these suppliers to better understand this myself as well. But I can say quite confidently that typically, so almost always, sustainable PPE options that we do have available on the market today are designed to meet the exact same safety and quality standards as we see with traditional products. So, just because we're seeing advances in things like eco-friendly options, whether it be biodegradable gloves or, maybe it's a helmet made from recycled plastic, um, it doesn't mean that we're compromising on the level of protection. And if anything, what I did see was I think because there is deviation from the standard materials, some of these sustainable products that use some of these more alternative materials, they have to go or undergo such rigorous testing to show that they can meet safety regulations while, of course, at the same time being environmentally friendly. So, if anything, I'm not going to say that they're safer, but they definitely go through often more rigorous testing. So, you definitely don't have to worry about the fact that that aspect hasn't been considered, because at the end of the day, it needs to provide protection. If it doesn't offer that, then it's not a suitable product.
Could I then move on to maybe a broader topic? But
Yeah.
how does best practice in the supply chain in this regard to PPE impact people and communities?
Yeah, really good question. And I think it can, of course, impact negatively and positively, just generally, whenever we think about this topic. I think if we're thinking about best practice being applied or implemented, it's really there to keep people safe. It's there to make sure that people are getting treated fairly in terms of the conditions within which they're working. It's about there to make sure that people are sourcing the materials ethically, and it's there to make sure that we're minimizing the environmental and the wider social impact as well. So I think when you implement best practice, what you typically see, which is wonderful, is that it affects people and communities in a really positive way. Whether that be through providing a really safe working conditions or safe working space for them, whether it's making sure that people are getting paid fairly, or even, I guess, on the environmental side, making sure that you are reducing pollution. All of those things can actually have a really positive impact. And what we actually saw was when we sourced PPE from suppliers who actually prioritized worker safety, and obviously also environmental stewardship, the people who lived in those regions, they actually reported that they had, felt an improvement in their life. They felt like, they felt responsible for the region. They felt like the company who was sourcing the PPE materials in their area understood better how it affects the community. It provided work to the supplier operatives in that region. So yeah, it really did bring a very positive impact, and it can bring a very positive impact if it's done correctly. I think the only time where if you implement best practice, it doesn't affect people in a positive way is again when people greenwash. So when people don't fully understand what best practice means, or they're not considering the full life cycle, they're not considering the environmental and the social impacts. I think if you consider these things in isolation, it does leave room for there to be a negative impact.
My final question then is again still in this sort of broad perspective, but PPE is used in everyday business activities, but we also see a use case for PPE in extremities, such as when natural disasters caused by climate change might strike. So, a question for those businesses: how can businesses who have a surplus of PPE support communities during these events?
That is a very good question. Of course, even though it's very sad, I can say that I've had lived experience actually in this, both in the developed world and also in the developing world. And what I've really seen is that, businesses, especially those that have surplus PPE, whether they come from a medical background or whether they come from a construction background or otherwise, they actually play a really critical role during climate-related disasters, whether it be flooding, whether it be fire. There's so many things that could happen. Because by donating some of the equipment that they have, especially if it's surplus anyway, to some of these affected communities, what they can do is make sure that the people that really need that PPE can get it quite quickly and without a significant cost. And typically what we see is that the businesses that have this surplus, whether it be the suppliers themselves or the businesses that have the extra PPE to hand, they tend to partner either with a donation program or maybe a disaster relief organization. And in doing that, they can have a really positive impact that they might not have thought of initially when they purchased that PPE, because maybe that PPE is now being used for a different reason. And I think if we think about COVID-19 from a social extremity, during the pandemic, there were so many people who really needed to have PPE. And there were amazing companies all across the world who looked through the inventory, they found surplus masks, they found surplus gloves, and they donated that to healthcare facilities and, of course, also the frontline workers. And I think to me, that was such a good demonstration of what it truly means to be sustainable. Looking at your community and seeing how you can support them, especially during a crisis, but then also looking at your own inventory, seeing an opportunity there, and then managing that surplus and managing that inventory more responsibly. So while I don't hope for another pandemic, I do hope that people can take a lot of lessons from the pandemic in terms of what it means to be sustainable, both from an environmental and from a social perspective.
Thank you. It's definitely a very positive message for us to end on there. And it's really interesting to think of it from that broadest possible perspective. So thank you very much. And Lise, again, thank you for joining us today. It's, as ever, been really insightful and really interesting to hear a lot of your opinion and stories from your actual lived experience, which is so helpful for all of us. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Phil. This was great.